This week on Perspective, power shift, the rise of Asia's global influence. It's not the first time. Indeed, over centuries, there have been predictions made about Asia's global influence, its power to shape the world we all live in. And at this point in history, some argue that forecasting Asia's global preeminence is a low-risk proposition. Consider this. The broad sweep of Asia, more than 50 countries, accounting for more than half the world's population, some of the world's largest economies, the biggest armies, and its ambition is symbolized by the multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. Instigated by China, but now a far-reaching infrastructure investment plan that our guest today equates to the founding of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan, all rolled into one. Often when we think of Asia, China comes to mind first. The arrest of a Huawei executive in Vancouver and the subsequent detention of several Canadians in China has strained relations between the two countries. And then there's the trade war between China and the U.S. that's had international ramifications. But China is only part of the Asia picture. On the program this week, a provocative look at what may lie ahead for Asia and the rest of the world. Parag Khanna is a big thinker, an author and global strategic advisor to governments and business. He's managing partner of FutureMap, a strategic advisory firm. His latest book is called The Future is Asian. You suggested that we need to change the way we think about Asia, right down to its geography. Yeah. So starting even from that basic level.
Right.
What do we need to think about when we use the word Asia?
Yes. Well, there's been a huge mischaracterization of Asia in the last 10, 15 years because all of our books and political focus has been on China. So when I say Asia, you think China. But in fact, there's only one correct definition of Asia. There's only one correct geographic definition of Asia, and it stretches from the Mediterranean and the Red Seas all the way to the Sea of Japan and from Russia to Australia. That's Asia. There's actually no geographic dispute about it. So what's been missing is this view of Asia that is inclusive, where China represents only actually a third of Asia's population. There are 4.5 billion people in Asia. China only has 1.5 billion of them. China is only half of Asia's GDP. China represents only about half of the foreign investment inflows into Asia and less than half of the outflows of capital from Asia. So let's put China in context. It was the Japanese story and the Korean story that inspired the Chinese story. And now China, Japan, and South Korea are the leading investors in the next wave of Asian growth economies, from Pakistan through India through Southeast Asia. That's 2.5 billion people, younger than China and growing faster than China. So those are just a few reasons why, when we say Asia and talk about Asia, we've got to get a much bigger picture.
But in terms of global influence, do we need to think of it as a bloc? Because there is such difference between those economies, as you point out.
Absolutely. Yeah. But they are a collective regional system, right? The Chinese economy is not an island floating above Asia. China became China because other Asians led the investment into China, right? So it is a collective story. In terms of influence, yes, China has a strategic agenda, right? China has a geopolitical will and geopolitical tools at its disposal that other Asians do not have. But even there, sometimes what we miss, let's take Africa, for example. We say, well, China's all over Africa. But what's often happening in many countries is that China goes in with its infrastructure investment, its factories, its special economic zones, even its arms deals. But within 5 or 10 years, it may abandon that country because it no longer needs to import as much cobalt or oil from them. But the other Asians go in. So the Asian influence in Africa is much bigger than just the Chinese influence in Africa. And that same pattern repeats itself in other places. So again, when we fixate only on China, we miss the ways in which Asians actually free ride, coattail, and cooperate with each other in ways that serve a collective Asian agenda.
Do you think, and particularly when you look at China, for example, and the tension that exists between the United States and China, the difficulties Canada is having right now with its relationship with China, are you suggesting that the geopolitical strategy or the ideology of China is overstated in the West?
China's ambitions in terms of having most certainly its regional dominance is not underestimated, right? That's clearly what they want. However, let's remember that empires don't always get what they want. And we tend to look at China and draw this straight line from China has a 1,000-year vision and plot, China always gets what it wants, everyone bows down to China. Can I encapsulate 4,000 years of Asian history for you in one sentence? It's multipolar. No Asian civilization or empire has ever been able to dominate the others for a meaningful period of time since the Mongol dynasty of the 13th century, right? And it's not going to happen with China. So let's be clear, Asia is the most ethnically, civilizationally, culturally diverse region of the planet Earth. Mm-hmm. They cannot conquer each other. They have mutually unintelligible civilizations and cultures. So let's not pretend that the lessons of European history have any relevance for Europe today, but the lessons of Asian history certainly have relevance for Asia's future. And if you look underneath the headlines, you can see that today, Malaysians are ripping up projects with China, like a railway. India pushed back against some roads that China wanted to build on their border. Pakistan has massively reduced the volume of the bilateral total infrastructure program with China by $30 billion. On the ground, across Asia, it doesn't look like China is getting everything it wants and dominating and steamrolling. Quite the opposite, right? There's a lot of pushback, and the pushback works.
So why is there that pushback?
Because no one wants to be dominated by China. Okay. No one wants to be dominated by anyone,
let's be clear. But do they see a collective advantage as an Asian regional group?
Yes, because again, all the while, despite these geopolitical tensions, that is following one path. And that's actually not a bad path in the sense that we've not had World War III break out in Asia. Asians are doing a good job of saying we've got our tensions over borders. Our aircraft, our military aircraft, our warships, our coast guards are skirmishing right now. There's serious geopolitical territorial disputes in Asia. Yemen to North Korea. Again, all of that is Asia. It's all on Asia, right? There are major problems geopolitically, but they've managed to limit those in terms of their spillover effects and the escalation that could occur into a broader war. Meanwhile, the economic integration, as we talked about at the beginning, have been accelerating, right? For the last 30 years, the day the Soviet Union collapsed is the day Asians began to integrate more with each other again. And today, they all benefit from the fact that they trade more with each other than they do with the rest of the world. They do not depend on America. And their largest trading partner outside of Asia is actually Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So the response to the trade war is not to, try to accommodate the U.S. Demands. It's actually to just simply further integrate with each other and make sure that they become less dependent on political pressure from the U.S.
You said that no region is better placed than Asia to capitalize on Brexit, opposition to Trump, and what you call the Western elite's revulsion with their own politics. Mm-hmm. So that goes beyond economics in some ways.
Does that sound a bit too strong?
No, you said it.
I know.
Why?
Well, actually, it's fairly obvious, right? I mean, for those of us who live in the U.S. or in Canada or the UK, we're pretty fed up with our own systems. And never mind what just elites say, we have reams now of public opinion research saying that the younger the decade or decile of people that you ask, the more they despise their political system, the more they're disenfranchised. And let's just talk about exactly those millennials. Because I moved to Singapore a few years ago, they're the ones that I see arriving by the plane load on
Where are
one-way
they coming
tickets. Oh, from Canada, from America, from the UK for sure, from Germany, from France, all over. And they're coming to Hong Kong, to Singapore, to Bangkok, to Ho Chi Minh City, to Jakarta, to Tokyo, to Shanghai. All of these cities are attracting not just any old footloose and clueless backpacking Westerners, the talented ones, the smart ones, the educated ones, the entrepreneurial ones, the ones who want to launch their startups in Asia, who capture Asian markets, right? Some of the best and the brightest that we have are on one-way tickets across the Pacific right now. They've been doing it for years. And I write about them in the book because it's a reminder. And in a way, it sure parallels a little bit my own story because I'm an immigrant to America. But I moved back to Asia. My parents' generation never would have imagined anyone wanting to go back to Asia, right? Polluted, poor, backwards Asia. But so much has changed that not only are Asians going back to Asia, but even Caucasians are going to Asia.
So how should Europe and Western countries like Canada, the US, and the UK then approach that huge mega region and the fact that it's got this younger population that finds it so attractive.
Well, we have no coordinated Western policy. The United States has chosen the path of, almost, backing away from free trade agreements like the TPP. Meanwhile, Canada has a different strategy, right? It's pro-immigration, and it's joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement very enthusiastically. Europe has a very different strategy. America has tried to block the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. But meanwhile, European governments like the Germans, the French, and others are all engaging in infrastructure projects in Asia to build these new Silk Roads because they benefit from it. As I said before, they trade a lot more with China and Asia than the United States does, right? So we have different strategies across the West for dealing with the rise of Asia, or China in particular, and therefore we are competing for those markets.
You also write about sort of the way governments in Asia operate and advocate for something that you call technocracy.
Right.
What is it?
Right. So technocracy is actually a French idea. It's not necessarily an Asian idea.
Right.
Asian societies, especially the democracies, have inherited actually British parliamentary systems. What they've done, though, is to not discard the role of the civil service the way that's kind of happened in the UK. In Asia, they have a lot more tolerance, even a preference, if you will, for a far-sighted, visionary leader who has a national agenda for modernization and inclusive development of the society. So even those leaders that we look at from over here and see as quite odious individuals, like Prime Minister Modi of India or Duterte in the Philippines, bar none, democratically elected leaders who, according to local surveys, are among the most popular leaders in the whole world today. They can have anywhere from 70 to 90% public opinion, satisfaction.
But I mean, often those public opinion surveys are dismissed because of the environment in which those opinions
yes
are.
And no. Again, you just need to spend 2 hours in the Philippines to know why Duterte is popular. Whether it's a few hours or a few weeks or months, amongst the 5 billion Asians, and look at where are they coming from in the last 30, 40 years, the poverty, the corruption, the stagnation. And when a strong man comes along, who's democratically elected, bear in mind, right? There are more people living in democracies in Asia than the whole rest of the world. So Asia is not just authoritarian China, far from it. Why do people support them? Because they're getting things done, right? They're building infrastructure. They want kids to go to school. They're trying to ratify national health care legislation, things that you would want to see people do across the world. That's why these leaders are popular. They're not necessarily technocratic. They might still be very corrupt. But there's a big difference between some of these leaders today and their agenda, which is progressive, and those that came before them who did nothing.
What does that mean for our view of liberal democracy, which is messy and often slow, but probably more importantly for human rights? Because that's at the core of what would disturb people.
Developing Asian democracies like India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and by the way, that's 1.7 billion people, so even if we just talk about those three, it's very, very relevant to conversation. They are navigating. Their democracies are very slow and very messy too. So the question is not whether or not they are sufficiently democratic, because they are democracies, right? It's can they channel that the legitimacy of democracy and the will of the people into action, right? So human rights is an issue, but human rights was an issue before these countries were democratizing. Remember, some of these came out of military dictatorship, right? So it's an ongoing process. But you don't fix human rights by lecturing them about human rights, right? You have to use your tools, your investment levers, your trade agreements, and education to get these countries to improve.
Put China in that context.
China is authoritarian. It's been authoritarian. It remains authoritarian. But let's remember that the other 3 billion people of Asia who live in democratic or democratic-ish societies, right, have no interest in being like China politically. You will not meet an Indian who says, they may admire China's economic growth. They may want to have industrial parks like China, but no one wants a Chinese authoritarian government. So the first lesson here is let's, again, not conflate China with all of Asia. China is going to do in China what China is going to do. And that's a whole separate conversation around can we try to limit their mass surveillance system, their social credit system, and the kinds of things that some of their own people obviously suffer under, right? But let's also not pretend that China simply can export those technologies of surveillance and social credit to other countries, and those countries are going to become more authoritarian as a result. Quite frankly, that's terribly disrespectful to the democratic cultures, the different civilizations and values that all of these billions of people have, whether it's Southeast Asia, India, or otherwise.
What lessons do you think Western liberal democracies could learn from the Asian model?
In many Asian countries, including to some degree in authoritarian China, because let's remember that Western political science, a community to which I belong, has sort of woken up and said, you know what? China is clearly an exception to a lot of our rules. Maybe we need to revise some of those rules. Maybe we need to see how they balance the input legitimacy, which they don't have in terms of democracy, but they have output legitimacy. They get things done, right? The will of the people in many ways is translated into benefits. Now, other countries do that as well. I mentioned civil services earlier. Again, in the United States and the UK, so the civil services that used to be so strong, that really helped build the modern nations that we are, have been decaying. Canada, fortunately, bucks this trend, as does Australia, New Zealand. Certainly, Germany and Switzerland and other countries in Europe and the West more broadly have the top-ranked civil services in the world, but they've decayed. But in Asian countries, places like Singapore, they have absorbed and inherited that British tradition and refined it and improved it. And by any measure, and the World Bank and many universities study this objectively, a country like Singapore has by far the best civil service in the world, right? They have more PhDs than they had before working for them. They've given them a higher budget to invest in technology and big data analysis and so forth. Where's our investment in that? So what can we learn from them? I'll give you some very concrete answers, and that's one of them, right? Invest in your professional, apolitical, and highly competent civil service, because it's a very complex world, domestically and internationally. Someone, and it's not going to be the voters, is going to juggle all of the issues and preferences and contrasting values that citizens have with the fiscal realities and the international competition. That's not something that you do when you go in a ballot box. That's something you need to have trustworthy professionals in government doing. Again, Canada has those professionals. Other Asian countries have been strengthening their civil services, while others in the West have been letting them decay. That's a big mistake.
Thank you very much for your insight and your perspective on this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Asian countries are 3 of the top 10 economies in the world. The countries with the highest GDP in Asia are China, $13.5 trillion. Japan, $5.1 trillion. India, $2.7 trillion. Korea, $1.6 trillion. Indonesia, $1.1 trillion. By comparison, U.S. GDP totals $20.5 trillion, and Canada's GDP is $1.7 trillion. North America's trade with Asia totals $1.4 trillion.
Parag Khanna talked about Asia's growing appeal to young people and the increasing number of them from Western countries who are moving to Asia to educate themselves or work. We tracked down some who've traveled from Canada. Here's their perspective.
Asia is a continent that we don't really learn much about in Canada. It's an entire area that's like, we know of China, we know of, Singapore being this powerhouse financial district, but we really don't know or learn much about what goes on in the relationships and the culture. So when I was looking at going on exchange, I wanted somewhere that was a total culture shock in comparison to Canada. I'm studying at NUS, which is the National University of Singapore, and it's the 11th best university in the world. So academically, I was definitely going to be challenged being here. Like, I wasn't taking a step away from my studies. I was actually excelling it by coming here. Students here study like 8 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock at night. The library on the first week of school was busy until 4 o'clock in the morning. It's really, really competitive. I'm motivated to want to come back here and be that business person who's in Singapore. It's encouraging because, some of the best people in the world are making their way here. And in the future, I want to be one of those people again.
This year, I've been interning at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm still currently an intern there. And I've really enjoyed it because it's given me the chance to get to know the Canada-Japan business community in Tokyo, and also learn more about relations between Canada and Japan specifically. One thing that I've learned in particular is Japan as playing like a major role in the Asia Pacific. I think that regularly you see articles that create the image that Japan is a country that's in decline. You hear about the declining birth rate and the labor shortage, but being here and seeing how vibrant it is, I think that you gain like a broader picture of how maybe integral Japan is to the region. One thing that I've learned specifically about the Canada-Japan relationship is that it's very important. I think there's a lot of dialogue about the relationship between Canada and China, but it's important not to discount the relationship between Canada and Japan because they're reliable allies and that there's like a long history of that relationship.
I took basically almost every Asian course possible in international relations at UBC. And from there, I got involved with a research fellowship, and I decided to pursue that further. So it was a very formative time for me because in taking all these Asian courses at the same time, there was a lot of debate about the re-emergence of Asian influence on Canada's foreign policy. So I decided to focus my undergrad in Asia and particularly in Southeast Asia. What I do here, I'm working on building a regional network for PPP and infrastructure financing. It's really a way to bridge the infrastructure financing gap in Asia, and some estimates go as high as having to fill a 5% GDP gap in order to maintain this, to sustain the growth needed in Asia for infrastructure investments. So what we're trying to do here, we're trying to support member states in their infrastructure financing strategies.
A different perspective on Asia's influence now, on how it's changing relations in the region, this time from India, also a major and growing Asian economic power. Dhruva Jaishankar is a foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington and New Delhi, and he spoke to us from New Delhi. When Asia is mentioned, particularly in the West, the first thing that comes to mind is often China. How is China's rise in influence perceived from your perspective, in the region particularly?
I think it's a cliche now that Asia is rising, and a big reason for that rise has been China's rise. China is by far the second largest economy in the world today. It's the largest exporter, the largest energy user. And in many ways, China's rise has helped to drive the global economy, including the Asian economy, including a country like India's. So it's helped consumers by lowering the costs of manufactured goods. It's created new opportunities. However, China's rise is also being accompanied by a great deal of concern in many countries around its periphery. In India, where I live, in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in Korea, in the United States, and of course in Canada as well. And in my mind, it's largely for four main reasons. One is China is an opaque system. It has an opaque system of governance. It's not very transparent. And as decisions made by China have global implications, it's not really very sustainable. And so in many cases, for example, China makes decisions that we don't quite understand why or how. And that, I think, causes great anxiety. The second reason is it's a non-market economy. It has the close relations between the state and private companies, which sometimes are not entirely private, and that creates various kinds of market distortion. The third reason is that China is in many ways acting in a revisionist manner. So it has territorial disputes with Japan, with several countries in Southeast Asia, with India, with Bhutan, and it's been acting in a manner that's trying to change the facts on the ground. And finally, it is China's been behaving in certain ways in a manner that seems to erode international norms, whether it is outer space, whether it's internet governance, cybersecurity, whether it's issues of connectivity, whether it's trade on many issues, and so a non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation. And so for these reasons, China's rise has also been accompanied by a great deal of anxiety.
Mm. At the same time, and we've heard some in the United States and others too, look at some of the examples and the reasons that you talk about the wariness around China, and talk about a global power competition. And you suggested that it's a mistake to sort of come at this with what you call a Cold War mentality. What's the right way to look at China's drive for influence then?
Well, I actually think the Cold War mentality is partly useful, but like all historical analogies, it has its limitations, and it actually hides more than it reveals. On the one hand, I think it is there's no question that there's greater competition between the United States and China, and for the reasons I outlined, I think it's likely to intensify. And in that sense, we will see more of a decoupling, perhaps, of the U.S. and Chinese economies, and other countries having to make some very difficult choices related to their relationships with the U.S. and China. On the other hand, some things are clearly different. The world is much more globalized than it was during the Cold War, and so the economic dynamics are fundamentally different in many ways. I think it's not just China that's rising. You have other countries, India, Indonesia, countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that are all rising at the same time. And that this will mean that the dynamics will be quite dissimilar from the Cold War.
You know that there have been tensions, obviously, in the U.S.-China relationship. There's also been strains in the relationship with Canada, too. But more broadly within the region, and I ask this partly because you're sitting in India, what does this suggest about the right way for a country like Canada, for example, to approach relations, given the strains that are there within the region itself?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak for Canada at all. I think that these are very difficult decisions that Canadian leaders will have to make in the near future. But from India's point of view, I think one is we have a large boundary dispute. Obviously, that's something Canada doesn't have. But to put it in perspective, this is territory the size of Montana. It would be like the U.S. and Canada contesting territory of that size, populated by 1.5 million people. So we do have an outstanding boundary dispute with China, and that is occasionally the cause of some tension. We have a massive trade deficit with China, of $50 billion trade deficit, which is larger than India's spending on defense. We have some key differences on issues such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which India sees as a strategic project rather than this primarily economic and market-driven project that China is trying to project it to be. And we have differences over global governance. I think China sees itself in a very different league from India and doesn't want to make space for India's rise as well at the global high table. So for these reasons, we've seen India and China butting heads much more and more over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is likely to continue, although there's currently a thaw in relations. So I mention all of this because I think it is in some ways useful for other countries to observe how China is behaving with countries closer to its periphery.
Dhruva, I thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Thank you.
About 2.6 million Canadian citizens were born in Asia. Almost 62% of recent immigrants to Canada were born in Asia. The largest share of immigrants are from the Philippines, India, and China. Canada's bilateral trade with Asia totaled $184 billion in 2017. Through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada has free trade with Australia, Brunei, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. And Canada has signed a free trade deal with South Korea.
And that's our program for this week. If you'd like to take another look at any of the interviews in the program or at any of our previous programs, they're all available on our webpage at cpac.ca/perspective. And now you can also take the program with you. All of our programs are available as a podcast, and you can find links to where to listen on our webpage as well. We'd like to hear from you. If you'd like to comment on anything you see or hear, you can reach us on Twitter and Facebook or by email at perspective@cpac.ca. I'm Alison Smith. Thanks for watching.